I'm Daria Matza, and welcome to everybody. We are a new podcast counteracting the pervasive myths and misconceptions about food, dieting, and body image with hard science and engaging storytelling. Today, I bring you a conversation with Virgie Tovar, a fierce fashionista. But focusing on her leopard prints and sequins and chunky jewelry feels way too limiting because she is also a fierce feminist. She's a fat activist and an expert on fat discrimination and body image. Virgie is also a writer and founder of BabeCamp, a course designed to help people break up with the diet culture. We started our chat with her childhood, a place where a lot of us experience our first traumas in our body. And I asked her if there was any part of her story that she would change.
If I could go back in time and change anything about my childhood in terms of the social interaction component of growing up, because that was the component that really has affected my life in so many concrete ways, I would have had those 5 or 6 sociopaths socially isolated and removed from my life. More and more recently, I've been thinking a lot about how there's this sociopathic minority and how this tiny, but very, very dedicated and vociferous minority kind of gets to dictate where all of our energy goes. And this happens on a personal level with our relationships and friendships and family, and it happens on grander levels culturally and nationally. So I think a lot of my childhood was dictated by this really small vitriolic minority of primarily boys who really made it their personal business to teach me that I was worthless because they were not attracted to me. I didn't have the kind of body that they were taught to treat in a certain way, in a positive way. They personally ostracized me and socially punished me every day of my childhood, from my introduction to kindergarten at age 5 all the way through to age 18 in high school. I was emotionally bludgeoned every day. And the rare day when it didn't happen, it was extraordinarily rare. So rare that I would, once the day was over, if there was a single day that I wasn't being emotionally battered, I would replay the entire day in my head and try and figure out what I did right, quote unquote, in order to try and emulate it the next day. And each time it would turn out that day just happened to be a fluke. There was no way to recreate it. And it just kind of had a lot of the characteristics of emotional abuse. I really don't like the word bullying because I think that it infantilizes this certain behavior that is primarily undertaken by boys. Bullying is a concept that gets overascribed to white masculinity and white boys as a way to kind of skirt the issue that bullying is all about boys undertaking the social agenda of society. It's no accident that the same people who society targets and marginalizes are the same people who always get bullied,
Right.
Quote unquote bullied.
Right.
And so I think there's this really intense way in which the language of bullying attempts to obscure the violence of society. And I think honestly, with fatphobia, that's very apparent. Fatphobia does ruin people's lives. I think there's a lot of reasons why I've been able to heal considerably from my experiences in childhood. If I could rewrite one part of it, it would be that this sociopathic minority was held accountable, was called out, was seen for what it was, was seen for the bigoted, sexist attitude and behaviors that were really happening. And I think that really wasn't taking place. How do you make children accountable? I don't really know. These are kind of the unknowable parts of the equation, right? But if I could rewrite a part of my childhood, it would be that these boys who made it their job to make me feel worthless and who succeeded weren't there. But the boys who are capable of doing what these boys did to me make up a tiny minority. And I think that's the reality. I think what's difficult, though, is these boys, the kind of boys who do this kind of behavior, are also manipulating and controlling other boys and other men. These other men or boys who maybe wouldn't do it feel intimidated by these more controlling people, and they end up kind of acquiescing because they themselves don't want to be punished.
They want to feel a part of some sort of community too, I think, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have a story you'd be willing to share from that time?
There were these two boys when I was in 5th and 6th grade, and I had a crush on one of them. They were best friends. And I had a crush on one of them. It was really multi-layered, right? Because like not only were they constantly like fat shaming me, at the time I just thought that I had to lose weight and become pretty and then they could like me, right? That was how I understood the experience because that was kind of what I'd been taught, right? That like fat phobia was my fault and I could fix it. I could stop this experience whenever I wanted if I was like serious about losing weight. And then these boys who had been so mean to me would then become like my boyfriends and then my husbands, right? Like
right. I mean,
like,
I mean, how many movies do we have like that of
exactly. I had a crush on one of them. Like I remember this one moment where I'm completely enamored of the one dude and I accidentally hurt his friend. I moved something on purpose and it hit him on the head kind of hard and it like really upset him. And his friend, the one I had a crush on, like turned to me and just punched me like so hard in the arm, you know, and I think what's so interesting about the layers of the experience is I'm already feeling like a weird, ugly freak. I already don't even feel like a girl because nothing in my life is pointing to me being an actual girl. Like I can't fit into any girl clothes. Boys treat me really poorly, which I've learned through television is not the way that boys treat girls. Boys are supposed to treat girls like they're gentle, delicate, beautiful flowers, right? I'm not getting treated that way. Then I have this person who's my crush who's very, very clearly not interested in me, but I just kind of have all this love in my little 11-year-old heart for this person. These two boys like are not only being like really fat phobic, but they're treating me in this kind of like rough way. So when he punches me, like when my crush punches me in the arm, it just has this like really intense feeling that I have like not only the physical pain, also that in that moment he was nullifying again everything about what it meant to be a girl because you just don't because of the gender education I received that was like the farthest place from how you treat like a girl in my mind. And so in that moment I felt this incredible sense of gender confusion, like I'd been kind of pushed into this masculine space yet again, and that not only was I gross and unappealing to my crush because I was fat, but like I was also a boy somehow because of the way that I was getting treated. And so I just think of that, like that moment has a pretty deep effect on me.
Yeah, that's an intense story for sure.
Yeah.
How do you describe the work you do today?
I identify as a fat activist. I do a lot of activism online through writing. I have 2 columns where I write about my life and I answer questions about people's journey in their relationship to their body and dieting. I lecture at universities primarily on the history of diet culture, the effects of fat phobia, what fat phobia is, and how it affects people's lives. I also have a course that I offer called BabeCamp, which is a 4-week online course where I kind of like walk people through what diet culture is, how it affects your life, how self-hatred is an ideology that you can learn how to manage and how to kind of gain the tools in order to really recognize like that it's not our or your any individual's fault that they learned that their body was inferior or ugly or wrong, but that we can actually let go of that idea and live a more full life.
Are there specific moments that brought you to this work?
In a lot of ways, it's like the entire story of my life. I was born into a fat hating culture as a girl, right? Which like was set the stage for, I think, in a lot of ways, what my life would unfold and become. I didn't learn fat phobia until I was 5. My whole family is fat. I grew up being treated kind of like a little queen. So I was really bossy, My family was like, I was the center of attention constantly. Everything I did was amazing and funny and wonderful. So I kind of grew up with this idea that I was really hot shit, right? And then all of a sudden at age 5, I'm introduced to fat phobia through, again, primarily boys. What's so interesting, right, is at the age of 5, you're absorbing so much new information. And fat phobia I was absorbing, reading, writing, math, while I was also absorbing fat phobia. So if you can kind of imagine, for like as long as I've been literate, I've known about fat phobia. I've been taught that fat phobia is a part of my life and that I deserve to be treated poorly because I am fat. I get taught fat phobia. I get taught that I am fat and that is the entirety of what matters about me, that fat is bad and therefore that I am bad, and that I can become good by essentially not eating and becoming thin. I have my first starvation experience ever at the age of 11. I continue to diet after that. Another starvation episode when I'm 18 years old. I get scurvy. So at 11, I decided that since I was about to graduate to 6th grade, which is my final hurrah in elementary school, that I really wanted to enact one of these like transformation teen movies that I was watching at home where, an ugly girl becomes a beautiful girl through hard work and
usually contact lenses.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. The movie I watched over and over and over again was like a made for television film called She's Out of Control, starring Tony Danza.
No way.
Yeah, and a young Matthew Perry.
Interesting.
Which is hilarious. Anyway, so I watched this movie over and over, and it was like the story of a fat girl with glasses, i.e. me, like working her ass off, like doing a ton of aerobics, having her braces removed and her contact lenses substituted out for her glasses, and then everybody falls in love with her.
Jeez.
And I was like, I was watching this movie and I was fantasizing about that being my life, right? And so I'm 11 years old and I decide that it's summertime. I need to take drastic measures if I want to return completely transformed between 5th and 6th grade. So I proceed to only eat lettuce and toast and exercise like 2 to 3 hours a day. I end up losing about 20 pounds, not a lot, but was a lot smaller, like body-wise, but was still fat by children's standards. I think what was really interesting during that time was at 11 years old, I'm like enormous by like 11 and 12-year-old standards, but because of like the working out and the shaping and all this sort of stuff, I then became very visible to adult men. Like I was tall and I had breasts already. I just kind of like I was already going through puberty at that time. And so it made me disgusting yet again to the boys at school, but I became hyper visible to adult men after that, which I think has its own interesting, complicated layer because I began to then pursue their attention because I was getting so much rejection from the boys at school. And I'd been taught that boys were such an important part of what it meant to be a person.
Right.
So I start pursuing it elsewhere. And this kind of begins like a long and interesting relationship to like extreme age differences and romantic engagement that I think honestly a lot of fat women know all about. That was my first episode. And then the second episode is again, I had a transformation fantasy. I was 18 years old. I was a freshman in college. I had the opportunity to study abroad. They had just introduced a new program. So I decided to use my financial aid to go to Italy. And I thought, a short-term opportunity to make a big difference in the way that I look. And my dream was to go, overseas for the first time and then return completely transformed, like very thin and unrecognizable to my family. And so I knew again, I would have to take drastic measures to get this outcome. So that was when I began truly starving myself, like really only eating maybe 2 or 3 spoonfuls of food a day. One of the first things that happens when you're not eating at all is that you lose equilibrium. This is like the first sign of scurvy, I later find out. So, like I end up not being able to stand up for very long. I can only stand up for 4 or 5 minutes at a time. I was like extraordinarily dizzy, very nauseous, very tired. Sometimes I would like go out to try and, go for a walk or go to class. And I would get so tired on the walk back, like the 3 blocks back, I would stop to rest on the bench, like 500 feet from my apartment. And at one point, I stopped to take a rest, like 500 feet from my apartment at this bench. And I wake up in the middle of the night alone.
No way. Wow.
My body is just shutting down. Even though I'm like having all these physical experiences that are very negative, I don't see the relationship between what my body is doing and my eating behavior. Like in my head, the eating behavior is positive because it's leading to weight loss. I was like starving myself, passing out in public, and I still didn't see the connection between that outcome and my refusal to eat. I get back home, I'm at my parents' house, and they feed me like an orange and it's all over it. Like it all ends immediately because I'm like eating food again.
Right.
Even after that, I still feel like it's my job. It's my duty to society and to everyone else that I not be fat. That's my job. Like as a fat person, my only job, the only job that matters more than anything else is to not be fat.
But clearly you've had some breakthroughs to get where you are today. Do you mind talking about some of those?
Like my first ever real breakthroughs happened in my first sexual experiences with men, right? Like because I'd grown up being taught that I was ugly, that no one would ever want to be with me, no one would ever want to date me, no one would ever want to marry me, and that no one would definitely ever want to sleep with me or touch me. And then all of a sudden, I decided to turn my attention away from boys my age and start pursuing attention from the men who were already interested, which was like adult men, like grown men, and found this like really interesting and again very, very complicated sense of acceptance through them. Like that, it was like all of a sudden I'm like, wow, well, so men do want to touch me, men do want to date me, men do want to marry me. And this was like this moment of extreme liberation in a lot of ways, because it just sort of opened up the possibility that maybe what I grew up being taught wasn't true completely. So that was like honestly my first ever breakthrough in any of this came because of like this attention I was getting from these older men who were like largely interested in me because I was younger, but also because I was hot, right? Like I was hot and that secret was being kept from me by awful sociopaths, right?
Right.
And then I ended up dating a really fat positive person, and he really helped me understand and see my body really differently. And he was like the person who helped me stop dieting. And then around that same time, I go to graduate school. I'm studying how fatness affects gender in women over a lifetime. And I begin to like get involved in fat politics and fat activism, which at the time was a very small movement and very queer and very like San Francisco, New York, Portland, the Pacific Northwest.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really the nail in the coffin. Hanging out with other like fat babes who were unapologetic and who were so committed to calling out patriarchy and calling out like fat oppression, and while wearing amazing swimwear was really what changed my life. And after I started meeting all these babes who were doing these incredibly fearless acts of self-love, I really wanted to introduce the world to them. And so I decided to edit an anthology called Hot and Heavy Fierce Fat Girls on Life, Love, and Fashion, which came out right as I was finishing grad school, like right after I finished grad school. And that kind of launched my work in a lot of ways.
You're such a fierce fashionista. Do you feel like that has also evolved with this new acceptance of being fat, or was that always there?
Yeah, it's interesting because I grew up with fashionistas. Like my mom and grandma are very fashionable. They're very crafty. Like my mom is the kind of person who if she could thrift every day, she would. And she would like upcycle and weirdly alter everything. So like she would buy, let's say, a denim skirt, and she would cut like 6 inches off the bottom and then sew lace onto it, and then like sew sequins, and then add like a puffy paint like underwater scene to her ass. And it was like it was just so intense, right? And then used to do it for me too. Like she would like buy a jean jacket. She really loved denim and cheetah print. Those were like her faves. But I remember once she made me this like denim jacket that I was obsessed with, the Little Mermaid, and she made this entire gorgeous scene from the Little Mermaid in like glitter puffy paint, kind of trying to like inspire me to be more adventurous, which I hated because all I wanted to be was invisible because I'd been taught that I should be. So I grew up with these like very fashionable women. And I think like in a lot of ways that deeply affected me. And so I had that background. And I think that once I had the platform, the permission to be myself after leaving my small hometown and like moving into bigger cities and meeting more people who thought I was pretty rad.
Right.
I returned to those roots, you know, and it's funny because I remember like after I started having sex and I was feeling myself. So I was having a lot of sex. I was having a lot of great sex. I started wearing like very tight clothing like all the time. And so it's funny because after I finally ultimately became a fat activist and began identifying as a fat activist, people were like, oh, we always thought that you were a fat activist because you wore such tight clothes all the time. And so it's really funny, like how people were perceiving my tight clothes, the political statement,
right,
before I even saw it as such.
Do you see it as such now, though?
Yeah, I absolutely do. I think what's funny, right, is like sometimes you don't decide what is political. Sometimes society positions you as political, and honestly just being yourself and just not being like completely normcore is quite political in this culture. There Absolutely, are definitely times where I am pushing like the boundaries with my outfits, and I know it, and I'm doing it on purpose, and I'm curating discomfort for other people, which I enjoy. And then there's times where I'm just kind of like, this is me. Like, I want to wear this enormous pink skirt with a tiny little hat and 8 strands of pearls and gloves and heels, and I want to wear bright pink lipstick and a bustier and a glitter cardigan, and that's just who I want to be. And you know, and it's society that kind of positions that as an act of rebellion, you know.
Yeah, it's beautiful rebellion, though. I mean, that photo of you on your website with the belt and the cheetah, I definitely view it as this beautiful poster of rebellion and social activism.
Right, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I did want to talk a little bit about vocabulary, but not a ton. I mean, I do think, you embracing fat, I think still probably makes some people uncomfortable, probably not in your direct community, but do you have that feeling?
Yeah, I mean, I think people grew up being taught that word is impolite, and I think that that it's hurtful, and I think that just because I embrace the word fat doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that everybody has permission to like use it however they want. I think it still has the potential to hurt, right?
Right.
Like it depends how people use it, and I think also a lot of times, like I'm comfortable with that word and I think that word is really cute and affectionate, but I know there are plenty of women who are the same size as me who would be just crushed if that word was used in reference to them. So it's like a complex word,
right? It's kind of like how you are self-identifying, but also it seems to be there should be more conversation about the social implications of using some of these words like overweight or plus size, right? I don't know. Do you have an issue with plus size?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I use that word specifically in reference to fashion. I mean, again, like I think like what's really great about identity is that you can kind of like somebody might identify as plus size sometimes, then identify as fat another time, identifies whatever. Like I think that I think there's a lot of room for the language to be fluid, and I also think like for some people that feels like a really good place for them to land. Like some people will. So like that'll be their launching pad. Like they might use a word like curvy, and then maybe a year or 2 or 4 years down the road, they'll start using other language that's a little bit more overtly political. But also there's people who just like, this is me. I like being plus size, or I like being curvy, or I like being plushy or whatever. And that feels really right for them. So I don't have strong negative feelings associated with it, but for me, it's specifically about fashion.
Can you talk a little bit about fat phobia, fat discrimination as a means of oppression?
Most people see cultural anxieties around fatness as a health issue, but that's a lie. It's not true. The anxiety is based in bigotry, right? The anxiety is based in essentially concerns about fat people and fat women in particular not adhering to like corporeal expectations because you're either fat or you're afraid of becoming fat. And so fat phobia is a way of controlling all people, and fat people become like they're like the example, right? Fat people are the people who are the examples of what can happen to you if you don't adhere to cultural expectations. It's an idea. So the bigoted idea is that fat people are inferior, right? And that fatness makes you ugly, unhealthy, immoral, and, all these kinds of other things. And so what's important to recognize is like that is an idea, right? It's socially constructed. This is not an idea that's always existed. Even in this current moment globally, it's not true across cultures. There are parts of the world where fatness is considered really beautiful. And like anthropologists are really obsessed with these places, right? Like one of the places is Mauritania, right? Where like there's actual ritual fattening that happens. Older women will fatten younger women and girls, and just sort of feed them like incredibly rich food past the point of comfort in order to make them big and have fat rolls and have stretch marks because the men in the community find that very attractive. All that to say, a lot of people in the US and the West generally really think that fat negative attitudes are like natural and inevitable, but in fact they aren't. They're like a socially constructed standard. What I've noticed is that whatever body type poor people have is the body type that rich people don't want to have. So when there's food scarcity that's commonplace, and the thin body is the poor body, then you'll see a sort of move towards fatness as an ideal. And then now, for example, where there's like food surplus and food is available widely and very cheaply, fatness is considered the body of like poor people and people of color. And therefore, there's a real fitness beauty standard. There's a real focus on fitness among the wealthy.
That's interesting. Absolutely. What about this idea of the diet culture as a mean of oppression? Just thinking about what you've since created since you gave up the diet culture, like all that mental space that was being used by obsessing. I've been thinking about that as its own means of oppression of women and how women who are in the diet culture, like what all those women could be creating in the world if that mental space was free.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like Naomi Wolf says that dieting is like the greatest sedative in women's history or something. Uh-huh. And, I think like, I agree with that sentiment. Essentially, what's really fascinating to me is that, a lot of women, most women are entirely pre-consciousness around their dieting behavior. They do not see dieting as a manifestation of their internalized inferiority. They do not see it as a manifestation of sexism. And I think in a lot of ways they don't see it that way because they don't perceive other people enforcing them to do it. And it's been so deeply ensconced in the language of motivation and self-improvement. When a person is restricting, they don't have enough calories to function. Their brain, their cognition suffers. Sometimes their physical abilities suffer, right? That's just a physiological reality. Then you take into account the drama, right? Like I think what's so deep about diet culture is that it's so dramatic. Every calorie, every pound, every time you go shopping, every time you have a bite of cheesecake, every time you walk past a cupcake in public, every time someone looks at you or doesn't look at you, it like makes or breaks your entire life in that moment, right? So it's this epic, incredible drama that takes up every ounce of your free energy. I think that when we start to see dieting as a disassociation mechanism, that in fact dieting is about women being angry, that shame is anger turned inward, and shame is the engine of dieting, we begin to really see how diabolical the whole system is and how it really, really affects and oppresses women.
What about men?
I don't work as much with men, and I haven't studied men. So I want to just preface that, men are not my area of expertise. So with that being said, in the limited way, yes, I think that fat phobia obviously resoundingly affects fat people's lives, like regardless of their gender. I think that fat phobia interacts really interestingly with masculinity. I find that across the board, right, like we know that women are the disproportionate consumers of like diet products. Like women are more likely to get gastric bypass surgery, more likely to do diet pills, et cetera, than men, right? And when it comes to men, I think one of the functions of fat phobia that makes the masculine experience unique is that in reading about like fat phobia and men, like in articles that address like articles and blogs and commentary that address like anxiety about fat men, there's a really clear thread of sexism in it, which I find really fascinating. So like I did research, like I did a paper a few years ago where I was looking at all of the different memes related to fat men. And the thing that kept popping up was actually the anxiety of feminization. Men were experiencing fat phobia vis-a-vis sexism. So like the top three anxieties that I noted in looking at all these memes and articles was like one, that fat men have boobs, which is like, again, this idea that like men aren't supposed to have boobs because men are never supposed to look like women. The next thing that was really common was the penis, or like, oh, you can't find a fat man's penis. His penis is very small or it's invisible, which again is about like gender ambiguity and like the inability to differentiate genitals, which is about, again, social anxiety about men looking like women. And the third theme that I found was chemical castration, I kind of called it. And it was that like fat men last longer during heterosexual intercourse than thin men. And what was interesting, and I would argue extremely hastily concluded, was that because fat men had more estrogen, they lasted longer than thin men who had more testosterone.
Interesting.
And so like there was this whole, again, it's about chemical feminization, right? And so like I found that most of the anxiety was actually about women, was actually about femininity, not so much about like the men themselves, but rather that men should be as far from women as possible because women are inferior, and it's like men's jobs to kind of hold it down. I mean, I know that's not the whole story. I don't think that's the whole story. The theme that really popped up for me over and over again was actually anxiety about the feminine.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I just am curious, though, about how you think social media has changed this fat discrimination, the diet culture, for the good or the bad.
I think, honestly, like social media has done a lot in terms of fat people, and I think especially like fat women's ability to self-direct representation. Representation is extremely important. If you do not have any representation of what your life can be, it's extraordinarily difficult to imagine it. And so before social media, it was the representation of fat people was entirely controlled by a very small number of really retrograde Hollywood executives, right?
Right.
By the way, and other people who were getting a ton of money from advertisers, including, the diet industry, in order to maintain this very small, narrow idea of what is successful and beautiful, right? And what social media did was democratize the representation. And I think that has had an incredible effect because all of a sudden you've got all these fat babes who are taking pictures of themselves like in amazing outfits, eating hot dogs, living their lives, making out with their partner, their boo, traveling, right? Like doing all the
Right.
things that fat people are taught that they can never do. And it was through the incredible proliferation of these images that I think people could begin to imagine a life outside of that like size zero model existence, right? And I think what's interesting in like just the history of portraiture, this cultural moment is there's more images of like normal people, like non-professionals in circulation than of models and wealthy people and whatnot, which is a very, very huge departure from the history of portraiture, which I think is really fascinating. So like I think just from the visual standpoint, social media has been extremely powerful in that way. More and more people are curating what exactly they're seeing, which is really unusual, and I think only could have happened through like the social media phenomenon.
But you were going to talk about perhaps the negative side of it?
Well, I mean, I don't know. Like, I think that one of the things I also really love is the proliferation of ideas, right? Like, in addition to images, there's all of these incredible articles and bloggers who are writing about what it's like to be fat, what it's like to navigate this world, and just kind of giving people language about understanding their own reality. And I think that, through kind of like Facebook, like microblogging and whatnot, people have had this incredible access to these ideas they never had before. I think kind of like the negative side of it, of course, is the trolling can be really intense for people. I think that I've personally seen a few of my friends just essentially opt out of the internet altogether because of what they've had to deal with and the backlash they've received just for being fat positive, right? Like just for being fat and amazing and calling out fat phobia. I'm fairly dismissive of the behavior in general, just because I see it as manifesting from a place of suffering. Only a person who is in extreme emotional distress would feel personally affronted by my wearing a cute skirt and eating a donut.
Like, what do you tell someone? I know you have an advice column that's fat and miserable, and they want to start a diet, and they're being called in and they're being tempted by this illusion. What's kind of your go-to speech for that person?
For a lot of people, they've never even considered the possibility that they don't have to diet. I mean, personally, for me, it was incredibly revolutionary to be introduced to the idea that I actually didn't have to diet. It had never occurred to me until I was almost 30 and I was deeply involved in activism. I think for some people, they just don't see any other way, and just kind of like modeling the language of like, well, I don't diet, or you don't have to diet. Did you know you don't have to diet? I think it's important to kind of like it requires walking a complicated line, because I think it's important not to be patronizing to people who are going through a lot, right? Like if somebody is expressing, if a fat person is expressing weight loss desires, it's because they've been living in a culture that has thoroughly dehumanized them and taught them that they have to do this.
Right.
And so to sort of like approach them in a patronizing way can be really isolating, and I think make things worse, right? So like I think for me, it's like just having a quick positive thing that you can say to this person is what I would recommend. Like, all bodies are good bodies, your body's beautiful. You don't have to change it. You don't have to diet. You can like live your life. You can do whatever you want at your current size. And I think that this is like so revolutionary.
Yeah. The one thing I wanted to talk to you about with that too is this idea of health that I think is being more and more debunked every study that comes out. But I imagine that comes up a lot. What's kind of your take on that?
What we know for sure is that dieting leads to weight gain. So attempts at weight loss over time, in almost every case, leads to weight gain. The other thing is that dieting and restricting, though they do not lead to weight gain, though they do not lead to weight loss, they do lead to anxiety, low self-esteem, and these things have physiological implications, right? Like we know, for example, that fat discrimination has really intense physiological effects. When someone is constantly experiencing stress because they're being discriminated against or marginalized, it lowers their immune system. It affects the function of their heart. It affects the function of their liver. right? It can lead to problems with pregnancy. It can lead to problems with a baby's health if you have a baby in that stressed out state, right? And we know that fat discrimination leads to these really negative health outcomes. And in some cases, in fact, leads to shortened lifespan, right? So
Right.
I think what in my opinion, what the data are really showing us is that the method that's being recommended to create these alleged health outcomes doesn't work, and that in fact it leads to health problems. So I think that that's the more compelling data set for me personally. I think the other thing is, like, we're humans, right? Like there are always going to be people who are not healthy. There are always going to be people who have like chronic illnesses, people of all sizes and ages, right? And class backgrounds and races. There's always going to be sick people. And I think this idea that we should all expunge or somehow work our asses off to become not that is deeply problematic. Yes, I think that if people are really focused on improving like their blood pressure or improving their long-term ability to like walk a mile or whatever it is that they have a personal goal of, that they can have these goals divorced from weight loss goals.
Right. What's in store for you for 2017, and maybe talk a little bit about this fat studies discipline that you've been a part of as well in terms of academia?
All the stuff that I'm going to tell you is on my website, virgietovar.com, by the way. But on May 10th at Kepler's Books in the Bay Area, I'm going to be doing an event with Jessamine Stanley promoting her new book, Everybody Yoga, which I'm excited about. I also just found out I'm doing a TEDx talk in San Francisco in June.
Nice. Was there anything that we didn't cover that you want to talk about as well?
No, I think that we covered a lot.
We did. We definitely did. Yeah, I'm so grateful for you spending time with me.
Great. Thank you, Rod. Okay, Rod, thank you. Bye.
Thank you for joining us today for this episode of Everybody. Make sure to subscribe for next week's episode with neuroscientist Sandra Amit, who will talk about her book, Why Diets Make Us Fat. It's science and myth-busting that our world needs. Until then, talk to us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We'd love to hear from you.